Wait, where? What? I'm in a box!
Oh no. No, not the box.
This is the Escape the Zoo podcast. With your host, Daniel Clark.
Welcome back. This is Daniel Clark here with the Escape the Zoo podcast, where we interview leading wildlife photographers, conservationists, and scientists to learn more about the awe-inspiring species that we share this fascinating planet with. Guests of the podcast have traveled to the edges of the world to observe, photograph, study, and support wildlife in their natural environment. And as you probably can imagine, now have some of the most exciting, scary, crazy, extreme, and beautiful stories that I have ever heard. Today's guest is Elliott Neep, an award-winning wildlife photographer and photographic guide. He has produced articles for major photographic publications, including BBC Wildlife Magazine and the National Press. We discuss a lot, from searching for tigers in India, to witnessing hyenas hunt flamingos in Africa, to extreme trips to both the Arctic and Antarctic, to the reason why Elliott decided to leave social media. I really enjoyed my conversation with Elliott. I hope you do too. So without further ado, here it is, my chat with the one and only Elliott Neep. Elliott, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I'm a huge fan of your work and really appreciate you taking the time to chat. When I was reviewing kind of your backstory and researching your history online, I noticed that when you decided to become a wildlife photographer, that you really spent the bulk of your time in the early years in India. Can you explain why?
Well, it's quite easy, really. The tiger was my most favorite animal. You know, it's my sort of first wildlife love. So when the option came up to go on safari, another photographer got in touch with me and said he was going to India. I basically sold a load of stuff that I didn't really need anymore to pay for the first ticket, and I went out. 2 weeks of very unsuccessful photography, shots of shaking cameras and shaking hands and heartbeats up to the 200. But it was amazing, and I was hooked within seconds. So I just wanted to go back and back. I didn't want to be a photographer that sort of did a lot of subjects and just covered. I didn't want to cover the subject superficially. If I was going to photograph a subject, I wanted to do it in depth. So fortunately, I met my fiance out there as well, and she's a huge tiger fan. So we were going 3 times a year, every year for about 4 or 5 years. And I think most people, when they go to the tiger parks, they stay for, maybe 4 days, 5 days in a park. We were staying in one park for 3 weeks each time. So we really massed, thousands of hours with the tigers, and it is just unforgettable. I still can remember each and every single encounter that we had. So well burned into the memory.
Can you walk through the process a little bit as to, once you fly over to India, where you're actually going and how you find the tigers?
Well, when I first went out there, I went to a park called Ranthambore, and then the second time I went out, I went to Bandhavgarh, and I made a few contacts locally. So the third time I went out, I got in touch with the contacts that I'd made, arranged a camp, a good guide, a great guide actually. He had his own vehicle. So really, it was a case of flights to Delhi, getting the train from Delhi out to Madhya Pradesh, where the tiger park is. We call it Bandhavgarh. And once I'm in the camp, just chatting with the guide, telling him exactly what I need, and he liaised with park officials, the mahouts, the guys that are actually sort of riding the elephants, forest guards, keeping us really up to date with any kind of tiger sightings. And I think because he's such a nice guy and everybody liked him, everybody wanted to help him, and everybody wanted to help him help us, because when we were there, we were sort of very generous with not just the tips, but we would buy the mahouts gifts. There's this sort of a local kind of legend thing that's come now that there was this really old guy on the gate, and during winter times it was so cold, like you're talking sort of 4 or 5 degrees, and the guy just had this sort of moth-eaten little jumper. So we went to the nearest town and bought him a huge quilted jacket, so that kind of thing sort of wins favor. And we did it because we like the people, and they don't have much. And it was nice to sort of be able to give them something, but it also sort of paid dividends and people were willing to help. So we had a really good network of, I suppose, ears to the ground, the real sort of bush telegraph really worked for us.
And the mahouts, are they in charge of patrolling the park and they ride elephants? Is that what you're saying? Yeah,
to protect the tigers from poaching and to protect the forest from illegal logging, they have patrols on foot, and they also have the patrols on elephant. So everyone carries a radio. Obviously, the mahouts on the elephants can traverse every bit of terrain there, apart from sheer cliff faces, but even still they get the elephants up extraordinarily steep escarpments. And once you sort of have the mahouts on side, you get to hear about where the tigers have been, the areas that they're sort of currently inhabiting, and sort of maximizes our chances of photographing tigers, because we're in a vehicle, we're limited to the tracks, whereas they can sort of wander wherever they are. But yeah, that's the basis of tiger patrols is either the guys on foot, remarkably just carrying a small hatchet and a stick in a forest full of tigers, and then there's the guys on the mahouts. So in Bandhavgarh there was 3, sometimes 4 elephant camps. So at any one point there could be 6 to 12 elephants sort of moving around the forest and keeping tabs on where the tigers are.
Oh, wow. And are there wild elephants in the area too?
Not in that particular area. There are further north and further south, but the elephants there are habituated from calves. They don't take elephants from the wild anymore, as far as I'm aware, in that national park. So the young of resident elephants within the park are then sort of, and it's a really sort of gruesome and horrific thing, seeing an elephant being broken in for them to use as a mahout. Far worse than you can imagine for any like horse or stallion that was broken in. It's something I became aware of later. And actually now I don't use the elephants for any kind of photography, just because I was so shocked at what's involved.
Without like the gory details, can you kind of explain what that means? I mean, you can include the gory details if you want, but it sounds like it's
not exactly gory. It's more sort of psychologically gory. It's sort of psychological abuse in that the young elephants are strapped down, tied down, legs splayed, and basically they can call it, they sort of break the elephant's spirit. They make the elephant dependent on the mahout and the carer for assurance and feeding and caring. But it's brutal. I mean, it really is brutal. And
so they essentially make it helpless, and then so dependent on the people that psychologically they think they can't fend for themselves, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And when you see it, you wow, it was really I get a bit choked thinking about it now. But yeah,
how did you see it? Was it something you stumbled upon, or are they just so open about it?
It was something that our guide sort of talked us through, because we were inquiring, how do they train the elephants? In sort of naivety, thinking that they sort of took mature elephants and trained them. When he told us, I then sort of looked at videos online, and I was absolutely shocked. So it's not something I can condone anymore, using the elephants for sort of tourism activities. I understand why they use them for patrolling the parks. The tiger and the elephant have a mutual understanding that they can both be extremely destructive to one another. So it is the safest place for a forest guard to be, on top of an elephant. especially when you're dealing with something that can predate on people. So I understand that and I accept that, but I won't use the elephants for any kind of sort of tourism or photography purposes anymore.
Yeah, geez, that's disheartening, but I can understand how it's not necessarily intuitive that that's how you would break in an elephant. I mean, I was researching for this podcast. I just had no idea about kind of elephant travel in general, that it was so common in India. And looking at it, it was something that I was like, I wonder if that elephant's happy, but I never really thought it was outside of having like a horse in a stable type of situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's no way near as common as it used to be. Obviously there's trucks and diggers and machinery that can do everything the elephants used to do. Then there's many sanctuaries that working elephants now sort of retire to. And it's strange to say, but when you do see the carer. So there's the mahout who sits on top of the elephant, and he's the professional that uses the elephant to patrol the park. But each elephant also has its carer, and that's the person that looks after and sleeps with the elephant day to day. And they make these enormous chapatis for them. Chapatis the size of a dining table. They sort of feed them molasses and bananas, and they bathe them and wash them. And as an outsider, if you sort of took that snapshot, you would look at the elephant and say, yeah, it's happy. It looks like it's playful, it's enjoying itself, but then you sort of look down and you see the massive manacle and chains that it's bearing, and then you sort of, sort of hits home.
You understand the whole story there.
Yeah.
In terms of the tiger conservation in general, is that something that in India, the tiger population is pretty healthy, or are they struggling with poaching in the similar way that Africa is with elephants?
Yeah, massively. I think there's been a constant battle since the 60s fighting against tiger poaching, mainly because of this ridiculous Chinese medicine beliefs of, the tiger genitalia will make you a great lover, or is a great aphrodisiac, or the bones will help cure whatever disease, and all these kind of outrageous claims. And it's not just tigers either. It's when the poachers can't get any more tigers because they've killed them all in a certain area, they'll then turn to leopards, because once it's broken down into its constituent parts, it takes a specialist, to work out the difference between, what's a tiger femur and a leopard femur, or,
right.
They just sort of break it down into parts. I think the battle is slowly being won. It's really difficult to sort of ascertain how many tigers there are. They keep discovering new populations. And say that the most recent population was discovered in Bhutan. There's other areas they've discovered in the Sundarbans. But since I've been sort of photographing tigers, I've known of entire national parks being cleared out. Suriska was completely devoid of tigers. They've had to sort of bring them in from other national parks to try and repopulate it. And it's a tough battle for everyone, because I think local poverty is so bad that if someone comes along and says, okay, here's $500 if you show me where the tigers are, to a local farmer, it could be a lifetime's worth of money,
Right.
It would it's a life-changing sum of money, but it's nothing compared to the people that actually sort of deal in tiger parts or traffic them. When I think the latest figure I saw was $50,000 worth once they're sort of broken down and sold. So offering a local villager $100 or $500 is nothing.
Nothing,
and that's,
yeah.
And to the villager, it's all wonderful for us to sort of say, oh, wow, there's tigers and aren't they wonderful? But imagine living with them and knowing that if you went to get just something as simple as firewood to keep your family warm, you could be killed because there are tigers there. So it's a different culture, and it's very, very difficult for the civilized kind of Western perspective to accept that, things are very, very different over there for people that actually live there. But I think the sort of battle is being won, I think, because there are certain non-government organizations that are putting money back into the local area so local people can actually benefit from the tiger rather than having this sort of monster on the doorstep. They're sort of seeing it more as a cash cow, and that, you know, there's all these wealthy tourists coming in, and there's employment in the hotels and the lodges and the camps, you know, that wasn't there before. And once the money sort of makes it sort of percolates down locally, they see it as an asset rather than, you know, this horrific liability that could sort of come
and
in.
I think that's something that's been really consistent in a lot of my conversations is people who have boots on the ground in areas where conservation is an issue across the board will explain that you cannot bring a Western mentality into understanding why the situation is the way that it is. And you really have to get an intimate knowledge of kind of at a grassroots level, what actual solutions could be. But I mean, for me, like I always point to, have you ever watched Racing Extinction?
No, I haven't.
So Sean Heinrichs, who's in that, who's also been on this podcast, he was dealing with the village in Indonesia. And historically, they'd always kind of gone out, killed a few manta rays every day and kind of supported the community. And then when the Chinese came in and helped them kind of do it in a more business-focused way, they started taking 50 to 100 out a day or something like that. And before long, the populations were almost entirely gone. And from an outsider's perspective, you can kind of sympathize with that community, right? If it's kind of historically ingrained into their way of life. I remember looking at the situation and saying, it's hard because you can't just tell people they can't do what they've been doing for hundreds of years and expect it to be an easy transition. But what Sean and Paul Hilton were able to do is work with them to focus on ecotourism and research and finding ways to really understand that keeping those manta rays in the water are so much more important to their way of life and sustainability that it took a situation that seemed really grim and unsolvable. And it's a huge success story. I mean, the manta ray population has just rebounded like crazy there. But I think
brilliant. Yeah.
It must be frustrating for people who live in that areas to hear people from Western countries be like, oh, well, you can't just kill the tigers. And it's like, yeah, but you don't understand that I need to put food on my table and things like that. But I think when conservation groups go in and help understand and also help give people the resources to be able to turn, it sounds a little messed up, but be able to turn the tigers into cash cows or at least help to support the community mutually. I mean, that infrastructure isn't always necessarily in place. So I think those conservation groups have to come in and help them kind of guide them in the right way.
They've done an incredible job. And I think also the sort of the history and the political nature, especially in India, you know, with it being a former British colony, they're very loath to sort of take advice. They're such a proud nation that they won't take advice from, Britain, or they won't take advice from the African nations with regards to sort of safaris and rewarding local populations for protecting the wildlife. So they had to sort of find it out for themselves. But I think it is starting to happen. You know, I think once the message sort of gets through that, you know, all these sort of valuable tourist dollars won't be there if all that is in the park is deer. Right. You know, people aren't going to travel to India to see deer and monkeys. They go to these parks, these areas specifically to see tigers. And once they're gone, so will the sort of tourist money.
Yeah, and there's nothing more frustrating than knowing that, I mean, for a lot of this exotic endangered wildlife trade, it's all just based on this bullshit, medicinal purposes that I think even in the countries that are trafficking these animals and using these products, I think it's more of a status symbol more than anything from what I can gather than actually believing in the inherent value in these products. But it is frustrating when you think of, I mean, from pangolins to tigers to sharks, that 90% of the reason that they're trafficked has just zero substantial backing scientifically.
Yeah, I mean, it's
the purposes that these people are killing them.
It's a horrible irony that, you know, all these animals are being slaughtered by the thousand for what is actually no reason at all, because there is no value in them. But, you know, once people recognize that, you know, they're worth more alive, you know, as the saying goes, but you can start to sort of win that battle. I think it's incredibly frustrating. But as I say, the tide is turning. There was these areas like Vietnam and China, the new middle classes, and they all wanted a tiger skin on the carpet. And the forecasts are there's going to be like 1 billion middle class Chinese in the next few years, and they all want a tiger skin. It's not going to happen. So there has to be some education. It has worked. I mean, there was I can't remember the region in Tibet. They used to wear a piece of leopard or a piece of tiger skin as a symbol, but because they could afford so much, they were then buying entire leopard pelts and entire tiger pelts. So people have gone in, they've re-educated, and now they've sort of binned the whole idea altogether. The Dalai Lama came out and said, this is completely wrong. So even just having this sort of iconic little patch of leopard or tiger skin is now a thing of the past, and it's a massive win. Yeah, it's a massive win.
And can you talk a little bit about, is there one special moment in particular with the tigers in India that stands out as just a beautiful moment that you'll never forget?
Yeah, I've got many. I suppose the one that I always sort of keep, that always comes to my mind, is the tigress was called Sukhipatia. It was in a region of Bandhavgarh that very few vehicles went to because it was rare for people to see her. She was quite elusive as a tigress. There were more visible tigers closer to the main entrance gates that people just sort of drove around in circles hoping to sort of literally bump into it. Mm-hmm. We didn't want to be part of the bun fight. We didn't want to be part of this sort of dust bowl that sort of gathers around tigers. We wanted to sort of go and find our own tiger, have our own encounter and our own experience. Unfortunately, it took 7 days of seeing nothing. I mean, quite disheartening after a whole week of 2 drives every day, hours and hours and hours driving round and round and waiting and not seeing anything. And then really probably on the last day thinking, okay, she really is elusive. We'll maybe sort of give this one up. We just came around a bend in the track, and there was a tiger cub, about a year old, just laid in the middle of the track staring at us. Wow. So we just sort of ground to a halt and we just stared at each other. And I have no idea whether with the first sort of vehicle that it saw, because as I say, it's such an elusive tigress, but the cub sort of went into the sort of vegetation on the side of the track, and we kind of lost sight of it, and then heard a sort of a crisp and a crackle, and we looked round, and it had climbed through the vegetation on a fallen log and was now standing about 1 meter from my shoulder.
Oh my God.
Staring in at us, and we were just like, oh my God, we're just absolutely in bits, but it was too close to even focus on. So we just sort of sat there looking at each other, and it was smelling us and just sniffing, and then it sort of backed down and it disappeared, and we thought, wow, that was great. That was amazing. And then we heard the jungle fowl, which is like a chicken. Mm-hmm. And they have a warning call, just like a normal chicken. And it was going absolutely berserk. So we just rolled the car forward a few meters. And as we sort of rounded this bush, on the left side, the tigress was just laid there, resplendent, sphinx-like, with the other cub. And then the other cub came around and joined it. And they just sort of sat there and just sort of looked at us. And we had, after going a week of seeing nothing, we had about an hour and 45 minutes just sat there looking at each other and just watching and just,
oh my God, just
listening to them breathe. And then the cubs sort of came into the track and played because they never felt comfortable with us because we hadn't made any sort of ridiculous movements or.
Yeah, I wonder if you were the first humans that had ever seen.
I have no idea, but I mean, our guide was in bits because he says he hadn't seen that tigress in years and years, and she was absolutely stunning. She had like these almond-shaped eyes, just unbelievably beautiful. And we just, I'm proud of the fact that we didn't even start the engine. We didn't move the vehicle at all. We just sat still, just took some shots as and when the sort of the opportunity arose, and we just let them do their thing. And then eventually the tigers sort of gave a couple of sort of low sort of grunts, and the cub sort of jumped off the road and followed her into the forest, and that was it. And then we were just on cloud nine, in complete ecstasy. Unfortunately, the word got out that we'd had this encounter, and everyone then sort of descended on the area trying to find her for themselves. Mm-hmm. So every encounter, I feel, has a double edge. Is a double edge. It's euphoric, it's amazing, it's incredible, but in a sense, you almost have to sort of keep the encounters to yourself and keep them private, because once word gets out, and I can't keep these things to myself. I want people to see tigers, and I want people to see how beautiful they are, and I want them to see that they're worth more alive. It's sort of this. It's really difficult to sort of say, I want to keep it to myself, but I want people to see it, but I don't want them to sort of abuse the situation and then, harass the tigers, which
it is a weird catch-22 where you want people to care. And I mean, similarly to what we were talking about, like ecotourism is such a better option than poaching. But the weird part of ecotourism is you also don't want to harass the animals and stress them out by just driving down their throats and making them uncomfortable so much that it actually affects kind of their way of life. Yeah. So it is a really odd kind of balance that you have to find there. And I don't know the answer.
No. And I will, I won't sort of look at it with rose-tinted spectacles. It is what it is. I know there's bad behavior in the drivers. I see it every day, and I see the same in Africa, where people just want to get closer and closer and closer. But it all comes back down to education, and it's up to people in sort of positions of authority and those that actually can lead by example, mm-hmm. that can educate people, and to tell people that you don't have to be right on top of these animals to appreciate them. Not everybody needs to sort of have such a close-up view.
I've heard in some of the African countries with mountain gorillas and chimpanzees that they actually do it in a pretty more reasonable way, in the sense that I think with the chimps, they only go up in groups of like 10 a day, and it's like 5 days a week, and it's only for a max hour, and everybody's permitted and things like that. So, and it drives up the price of the permit too, because it becomes a supply and demand type thing. So maybe there's something like that can eventually get adopted there. But that's all hearsay too. I don't know if that's necessarily the case. It's a different situation, because I mean, I've done the gorillas many times, and it's a nice small group that goes up. The permit now has gone up to $1,500. Yeah, it's not cheap. No, you trek up. You're allowed exactly 1 hour with them from the moment that you encounter them, and it literally is 1 hour. 1 second past, you're on your way back down again. You're kept at a 7 meter distance because they don't want you to transfer any sort of human mm-hmm. airborne diseases, and it's very, very tightly controlled. But then the gorilla family is very, very tightly focused. They're not sort of spread out; they're sort of in pockets within the forest. Right. So it sort of makes sense to take a group to each gorilla group, have the encounter, and go back again. But on an open plain, like the savannah or in the tiger parks in India, it's not something you could sort of do as a sort of per view basis, because you're never guaranteed, right? Yeah, to sort of see the tigers or anything. So it is. I think it's finding its feet. It really is. I've over the past sort of 10 years, I've noticed situations get really completely out of hand, and in the past few years, I've seen more educated drivers. I've seen more initiatives to educate local people. I've seen better behavior, and it feels like it's finding its feet and it's settling. And there's sort of a momentum about environmentalism and protecting these animals, rather than just being
there for the for the joy of it and just sort of seeing it as something to tick off a list.
That's encouraging.
There does seem to be this more sort of holistic approach about the environment, enjoying the habitat and experiencing nature in the raw. Sometimes, you see death and decay, but you see sort of the birth of new life. And I think a lot of the time, as I say, 10 years ago, I would see a lot of people just be there for the day and they wanted to tick off the big five, which is a horrible concept anyway.
Yeah.
And disappear. But now I just sense more people. And I think wildlife photography has helped. A lot of people have got into wildlife photography. A lot of people are in it for the photo to put on Facebook or Flickr and have people like it. But at least they are there in the environment and they are seeing it and they're witnessing it for themselves, and they can take that memory home. They can share it with their friends and family who then may come out as well, and you get this sort of momentum, the tidal change of, a better interested tourist rather than just a self-absorbed tourist.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the democratization of some of this high-end technology too really helps with that, where your average person can go out and definitely not get photos like you're taking, but can at least get photos that are Instagram worthy.
Well, they can. I mean, that's the whole point. They can get exactly the same photo as me because we're using the same equipment. When I'm taking clients around, I'm telling people my settings, so they are photographing exactly the same in a sense, which is one reason earlier this year I decided to move away from 35mm digital photography into medium format, because I've just felt the need to sort of challenge myself and do something a little different.
Yeah, break out of the box a bit.
Yeah.
Has that been challenging?
Yeah. I miss my 600mm sometimes. Yes. Yeah. I think that was one of the problems. It's not, again, a catch-22, having a big lens like a 600mm. Very, very little is out of range. You get this amazing sort of shallow depth of field, nice diffuse backgrounds. It's a beautiful piece of engineering. But it also made me kind of lazy because I knew I could pretty much photograph everything in the style that I wanted to photograph. And when I really thought about it, honestly, I felt less and less engaged, in a sense, because the cameras are so good, the lenses are so good. It felt like it took very little effort and thought on my behalf to take a good photograph. I would just pick the camera up, take a shot, great, got it, move on. That's not the reason why I got into wildlife photography. I got into it for the art and to experience the wildlife. And the move to medium format has slowed me right down. Everything is much more mechanical. Okay, it's still a state-of-the-art mirrorless medium format camera, but its functionality is more simplistic. I don't have a giant lens anymore. My longest lens now is 110mm, which is a 90mm equivalent. So I've lost over 500mm in focal length. So it forces me to be incredibly patient, and it just slows everything down. And my recent trip to Skoma, which is a small island off the Welsh coastline, it's famous for seabirds, especially the Atlantic puffin. And normally I'd have shot hundreds and hundreds of pictures, and I think on day one I had taken 12 frames.
Oh, wow.
Instead of hundreds and hundreds, because I was forced to wait for things to come into range, and then I wanted them to be exactly where I wanted them, and I was shifting around a bit to make sure the background was perfect and the angle of the light was perfect. And it was great. I mean, I got a kick out of it. It was the buzz I had when I first picked up a 600mm and sort of looked through it and thought, wow, this is it. I'm now getting this with the medium format because I suppose I'm almost rediscovering wildlife photography again, and I'm starting, on a very sort of basic level in a sense.
Yeah, but I do think those are the photos that really jump out at this point in time. I mean, if you want to go in and find a portrait of any animal online, you're going to find one, but kind of getting a sense of the background and the uniqueness and the landscape that they're a part of. Medium format really does that in such a beautiful way.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I was on Instagram, and all I would see is, you know, sort of close-up portraits of big cats and gorillas and everything. You know, it was headshots, but you know, as much as I liked them and I enjoyed photographing them myself, it said nothing about the environment. They could well have been photographed in a zoo. You know, they're completely out of context. Whereas, so it's forcing yourself to use a shorter lens means, you know, you really have to think about the composition. You really have to appreciate, you know, the environment and the background, and only take the shot when you can see there's an evident link between the subject and its environment. Otherwise, it's not a shot. You know, there has to be this sort of like triumphant of things going on. And I can't really photograph animals in isolation anymore because, you know, the limited lens size. So, but I mean, I'm excited by that. You know, I think some people would feel stifled that they can't get, you know, right into the action. But I'm actually sort of enjoying the fact that I can now, you sort of capture, you know, great big skies over the savannah, and, you know, I'm still sort of relatively close to the subject, but with a wide angle lens, I'm sort of capturing it all in the most exquisite sharp detail, just ridiculously sharp. And it's such a large, beautiful file that you can sort of zoom in at 1:1 and just see the most outrageous detail. I mean, from this sort of recent trip, I found things on puffins that I never knew existed, like the textures around the bill and around the eyes, and, you know, it was a real eye opener. I'm excited by it. So
yeah. Well, the puffins in general, I feel like people are finding out a lot about them recently. They just found bioluminescence or fluorescence. I forget which one it was.
That's right, in the bill.
Which is crazy. Yep. I read that, kind of bringing it back to India, that there was a distinct reason that you decided to stop focusing on the tigers in India and move on to the next phase of your wildlife photography. Can you talk a little bit about the reasoning behind that?
The reasoning was twofold. The first reason was I saw a tiger dying. I'd found a large male tiger, and it had just come back in the park, obviously in immense distress. And when I looked with the binoculars, it had a huge facial wound, like a bullet hole. And we raced to the gates to inform them that there was a wounded tiger. And what followed was nothing short of just an immense cover-up. The tiger died, and they cremated the cat before an autopsy could be carried out, and then they blamed the wound on another tiger, saying that it had been in a fight. Now, I've seen tigers fight, and there's lots of scratches, there's lots of wounds. On this occasion, there was just the one. You know, this one big hole right in the face of the tiger. And so they basically covered it up and swept it under the table, or under the rug, rather. And it left an extremely foul taste in the mouth.
What did you think it was?
Well, later we learned from one of the mahouts that was there, it was a wound caused, they think, by a homemade landmine. Now, I know it sounds a bit sort of far-fetched, but the sort of local farmers, to protect their crops from invading wild boar and, you know, to stop them sort of eating all the crops, sometimes they leave these charges in the ground, and it's basically a bolt that is just fired upwards. It's not like an explosive charge, but it's a bolt that's fired upwards. And the mahout said this is what was in the tiger's head. Ugh. He put two fingers right inside the wound, and he said, yeah, you could just feel around in there, it had been completely sort of exploded inside. So
Brutal.
yeah, and the forest department didn't want to know, because basically for a forest department director to admit that, you know, tiger's been killed on their watch is scandalous, and they do everything they can basically to avoid admitting that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was it. I mean, we were in shock, and you know, we thought we would see some sort of legal intervention, but there was nothing, and we kind of just felt sick, and we left, and we didn't go back for several years, and to be honest, the whole thing was becoming very political with tigers. This is sort of 2006, 2007. There was a lot of emphasis on, well, there was an enormous amount of poaching going on. There was an enormous amount of cover-ups going on, and we just couldn't stomach it anymore. And it felt like the time had come anyway to sort of branch out and photograph something else. So we moved to, I say we, this is me and my other half. We moved to the Masai Mara, because the Great Migration was something that we always wanted to see.
You moved there physically, or you moved like your trips there every year? My trips, my
photography focus. So we started going there, and you know, it was as amazing as everyone said it was. And I think a lot of people do the Great Migration first, and they do Africa time and time again, and then they go to India as sort of an afterthought. And I'm glad I did it the other way around, because I think it's sort of an incomparable kind of safari. Whereas in India, you're focused on one animal, really. Okay, there's deer and there are monkeys, but yeah, they're not that exciting, and you're really there for the one animal. Whereas in the Masai Mara, in the Serengeti, you've got leopards, lions, cheetahs, elephants, zebras, giraffe, you know, the massive herds of wildebeest, crocodile. You know, it's not to mention, you know, the amazing bird life as well.
It's the greatest show on earth.
Yeah, it really is. And I understand and appreciate why people had always said to me, you know, you really need to go to the Masai Mara. You need to get there. You'd love it. And yeah, I do. But I really appreciate the time that I spent in India, sort of focusing on tigers. And I'm glad I did it then. But yeah, I've been doing the Masai Mara and northern Tanzania pretty much constantly since 2007 now.
Do you have a favorite animal that you focus on when you go on those trips, or is it a wide variety?
A lot of my colleagues are really focused on leopards, and I understand why. You know, they're elusive, they're incredibly beautiful, but my favorite is the cheetahs. So, because for me, I look at the leopard, and it's a powerful animal. It's an ambush predator. It can stay out of harm in the trees. The lions are massive. They're hugely powerful. They have huge prides in the Masai Mara. They can almost kill at will. But the cheetah is a very, very slender, a very, very lightweight cat. It's called a big cat, but it isn't technically a big cat because it can still purr. It can be forced off a kill by almost everything else. Lions can chase it off, hyenas can chase it off, baboons can chase it off, jackals together could chase off a cheetah. Because it's so lightweight, it can't afford to risk being injured. And then you have the female cheetahs that can bring up to 6 cubs to adulthood, you know, despite being right at the bottom of the pecking order. And on top of all this, they have just that explosive speed. And I'm in love with them. I'm in love with their fight. I'm in love with their spirit and their survival attitude. And I'm blown away by the females that can sort of, in the spite of everything, bring so many sort of cubs to adulthood. Yeah,
the crazy thing with cheetahs too is something that I really revere is they call them, I think, super mothers, which are essentially, I think the cheetah cubs have some absurdly high infant mortality rate or cub mortality rate of like 80 to 90%. But there's these certain mothers who will not only raise their entire litter to adulthood, but do it time after time after time. And it's really bizarre when you see that 90% mortality rate in most of the cheetahs, and then you get this one mom who's raised hundreds with zero mortalities. But I can understand that. It's definitely a different life for a cheetah versus the other big cats out there.
Yeah, and I think they also get an enormous amount of attention from tourists because they're one of the few animals that are active during the daytime, actively hunting during the daytime, whereas, lions pretty much from sunrise to sunset are fast asleep. The hyenas are sort of always trotting on the move or just laying around sleeping. Leopards are very hard to find in the first place, and if you do find them, they're sort of almost completely obscured by trees and leaves. So a lot of attention is brought down on cheetahs, and it can make their life even harder. I mean, I've photographed situations where there's been a cheetah with cubs, and she's trying to hunt. She's trying to feed her cubs that are obviously sort of starving, and she's, her stomach is completely wasted away. She's starving, yet she's completely ring fenced by vehicles. She can't see out of, and then she can't see the approaching lions until it's too late. And I've seen situations like that, and I've seen cubs be killed by, a lioness who's just sort of walked in between the vehicles and, cheetah cubs, bang.
Oh God.
It's, but it comes back to what I was saying earlier about education of not just the drivers and the guides that are there, but the people in the back taking responsibility, for what's happening, and not just saying, well, I didn't know better. It's it's the driver. But
oh God, that is something I could not live with if I knew I was involved in the death of a cub for some stupid reason like that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's all this sort of mentality of trying to get as close as possible to get a photograph or, the sort of the closest experience possible, because they, that especially in the Masai Mara, some of the cheetahs will climb on top of the vehicles and the cubs will sort of jump up onto the tires.
It's like for a vantage point, right?
Yeah,
it's such a flat area.
Yeah, so they they'll use a low-lying tree, or they'll use termite mounds. If there's none of them around, they'll use a vehicle. They'll jump up on the bonnet, and people love it. Oh wow, it's so amazing. But then they don't stop to think that if this tiger slips on the bonnet, catches its leg in the front grille, it breaks its leg.
It's done.
It's done. There's no sort of happy ending for this cheetah, and it's sort of there is an initiative there now educating drivers to sort of only sort of fence one side, so there's always an escape route for cheetahs. Never to sort of completely ring fence them, only to sort of be with them for a certain amount of time. Sort of limit it to 5 minutes and not just hound them the whole time. And that's sort of slowly sort of percolating through. And I really hope when I go there again this season, I see some sort of forward momentum of that. I mean, I work with good people, and they try and sort of yell at these other sort of drivers that are they're not educated. They're basically there. They've invested all their money to buy a vehicle to try and earn some money, and they're not aware of the sort of the guidelines or the rules. They don't really care. They just want the big tip. And it's sort of up to the camps and lodges and the other drivers to educate those particular drivers in proper sort of behavior. I sound like I'm a real, moaner about it all, but it's a horrible kind of thing to witness. And you're shouting till you're blue in the face, and they don't care that they're sort of jeopardizing the life of the thing that is actually bringing them in income.
Right.
They don't see it. And that's sort of what makes you sort of so frustrated.
Yeah, I feel you. One of the more unique photographs and series of photographs that I saw of yours, I think it was just outside the Masai Mara, was a hyena interacting with a group of flamingos. Can you talk? Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, that was Lake Nakuru. It's another national park. Just 2 hours drive from Nairobi, so a very easy one for people to visit. It's a soda lake. At one point, it had approximately 3 million flamingos, but due to sort of water shortages and pollution, the lake is losing its alkalinity, and the population of flamingos is dropping. But
That's
when
a
I was
huge
there,
number, 3 million.
yeah, it's down to about 1 million now, or 800,000. Yeah, it's pretty bad, but it's the same story everywhere, to be honest. When I went there, I'd seen a documentary about hyenas hunting flamingos in Lake Natron, and a friend of mine said he was going to Lake Nakuru, and he'd heard it has happened there before. So I thought, yeah, I'll give it a go. I was there for about 4 days, and I didn't see anything until it was literally about 30 minutes before my plane was due to sort of fly out of Lake Nakuru to the Masai Mara. It was parked on the shore, and we spotted 2 hyenas trucking down the shore towards a large flock of flamingos that were sort of cleaning and preening themselves in this inflow of fresh water. If you remember, it's all very, very strongly salty water.
Mm-hmm.
Any abrasions can get infected quite quickly, so they use these freshwater inflows to preen and clean. It seemed like the hyenas kind of knew this. They knew exactly where they were going. As they sort of came trotting down, one of them started darting in to the flamingos, and the flamingos would get all ruffled and they'd move away about 100 meters. Then they sort of slowly come back to the shore. And the hyenas did this a few times. They made these sort of false runs into the flocks. And what we worked out they were doing, they were trying to work out which flamingos were lame. By making them all try and fly away, they could see which ones were the slowest to run. So in the end, they sort of did a dart in. Again, the flamingos got all ruffled, and the hyenas came back to shore and started playing and rolling around in the sand, and the flamingos seemingly thought that they had lost interest and came really close to shore. And then the hyenas just exploded and just ran straight into the flamingo flock, and both of them just came trotting out with a flamingo in their drawers. And
oh my God.
They'd hit the lame flamingos spot on. And it was just this, it was a remarkable thing to see, that especially because the hyena gets such a rough deal in the media and these documentaries. They're always portrayed as the bad guy.
Well, they were very mean in The Lion King, to be fair.
Yeah, very mean. I mean, they were pretty rough there. But again, it was this perspective that it completely changed my attitude. That, you know, these weren't these sort of just dumb scavengers. They were these extremely intelligent hunters. And the more I looked into it and the more I researched about hyenas, the more I realized they were the most successful pack hunter, you know, next to the painted dogs. And they are intelligent. You know, they're not just this sort of brutish thug that comes along and just bullies other animals. They are, you know, incredibly smart, extremely powerful. I mean, I've seen them hunt a wildebeest.
Really?
And they sort of ran it down that it was exhausted, and one of the hyenas basically took a bite out of the wildebeest's leg and basically severed it. In one bite.
Jeez.
Yeah, through the bone and everything. It was awful. Oh, it was awful to see, you know. But
part of it.
There's a part of me that was like, bloody hell! Wow, these are serious predators here, and I think a lot of people don't like the hyenas or the dogs when they attack animals, because, you know, they're obviously eating the animal while it's still alive, whereas the big cats, they always sort of strangle and subdue and suffocate their prey before sort of devouring. But, you know, the dogs and the hyenas, they'll just sort of bite straight into animals while they're sort of flailing around in agony and just.
Well, the crazy thing too is if you took one of the strongest humans that you could imagine, like a world's strongest man, gave him an axe and put a wildebeest in front of it standing still and told him to swing as hard as he could, he'd probably have a difficulty in one swing. Taking off a leg. And the fact that a hyena can do that with its freaking mouth, like while the thing is running, is an insane thought.
Yeah. it was shocking, and it was sort of, people were in awe, but they were also shocked, that it was so lethal. And I think people were just expecting it to sort of just run this, wildebeest to the ground until it was exhausted, but it didn't even wait. It was basically eating it while it was running. It was horrific. It's the stuff of nightmares for some people. But as I said, these places are where you see nature in the raw, completely, unwrapped, completely,
Unfiltered.
there's no filters.
Hyenas are crazy too, because in Planet Earth 2, they have that urban, or like the urban episode where it shows animals interacting within cities and within humanity. And there's almost, I don't want to use the word domesticated because they're still in the wild, but there's hyenas that come in and have friends in the neighborhoods and villages that feed them at night. And I was watching this one guy who was giving it literally slabs of meat from a butcher shop. And I was like, I don't think I would want to be that close to that thing.
But it did make me laugh, because it made me think of these guys in the inner city that walk around with pit bulls and stuff. And then there'll be this other guy in Africa walking around with a hyena on a lead. Yeah, you win. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but I thought it was just really interesting to think through. One, I just never knew hyenas hunted in that fashion, but it seemed, through talking to you, it's so procedural. Like, it was something that they just have a process to go through, and they're like, if we take these steps, we'll get one of these lame flamingos. It just shows a level of intelligence that you never attribute to that animal.
And it seemed, when I think it was something they've learned from older hyenas, and it's something that's been passed down, because when I spoke to the guide, he said there was only just this one clan that hunted the flamingos this way. The others didn't sort of hunt flamingos. They didn't really know how to. So it's obviously, at some point, one hyena has developed this sort of hunting technique, and it's just been sort of passed down. I remember the tigers, Tiger Moon in Ranthambore, developed a strategy for killing deer only as in when they were sort of waist deep in water. Because some of the samba deer, the large deer in India, they come right into the lakes and they feed off the water lilies and the water vegetation. And they get really slow because they're in the water. And the tiger just would wait for them to get so deep, and then just pow, just charge straight through the water, like hydroplaning, and just hit them right in the water. And just
and not to spin this in a negative way, because I feel like we focused a lot on tough conservation issues, but that's what stresses me out a lot when you think about a lot of conservation can deal with reintroduction of animals into new areas and relocating animals and general population dynamics in general of, how are elephants doing? Or, how are tigers doing? But you're really ignoring the subsegments of specific animals that have really evolved to very specific geographic regions that if that clan of hyenas for some reason is impacted in a negative way, you're losing behavior that's been ingrained into them for generations, and you're losing something you'll never get back. So
it's always the way,
not to be depressing, but
we don't know what we're losing before we've already lost it. I mean, that's part of the trouble with this sort of rapid extinction event. There's species that we've lost before we've even known we've identified them. And I think it for me it keeps going back to sort of protection of habitat, and going back to India, that, as I said before, people won't go to see deer and monkeys, but if you keep logging the forests, then there's going to be nothing for the deer. If there's no deer, there's no tigers. So, poaching aside, forest, the removal of the forest is a far greater threat to the tigers than poaching.
Well, and the real kicker is the fact that a lot of the forest removals, I'm not sure as much as India, but definitely in Indonesia, is for large conglomerates of Western-based companies. It's not necessarily like, this is an impoverished area and they need logs to build their homes. I'm sure there's some of that. But there's also, you're talking about the orangutans in Borneo and stuff like that. That's Procter and Gamble, and that's Frito-Lay, who want cheap palm oil to put into their chips and toothpaste.
We want crunchy biscuits, so orangutans are losing their trees.
Bullshit.
It is crazy. It is crazy. In India, the dichotomy is that the tigers are under the management of the forest department.
Mm-hmm.
And the forest department are responsible for logging the forests. Exactly. So
Yeah.
on the one hand, they're trying to protect the habitat of the forest, but they're the ones that are actually responsible for chopping down the trees and managing the woodland. And that was what we came up against when we stopped going, I think, was that realization that the forest department were not interested in protecting the tigers because it cost the forest department millions of dollars to manage the tourism side of tiger viewing. For them, it would be much simpler if there wasn't any tigers. And that was evident. Yet if the tigers were under the management of the tourist department, it would be a completely different story.
Right.
You know, if the tourist department had management of the tigers, you could see a lot more money being plowed into their management and their protection, guaranteed.
And it's another one of those things where it's like the medicinal purposes of exotic wildlife that have no purpose. Like, it's just very frustrating to see. That's just because bureaucratically they were probably put into the wrong subsegment of the government.
Yeah.
But let's get back on fun things. I saw after the Masai Mara, you headed to kind of these polar region treks. Can you talk a little bit about, did you head north or south first?
I headed north first, only because it was closer and cheaper. You know, from London, it's a 2-hour flight to Oslo and then a 2-hour flight to Longyearbyen, which is the main city in Svalbard.
Not to interrupt, but when you say it was cheaper, to put into perspective for folks, I mean, you are one of the most successful wildlife photographers out there, at the top of the class. Are most of the trips that you're doing, is it you fund the trip, you kind of risk financially the fact that you're going to get some images that you can then there and buy, sell? Or is it often where you're kind of employed on assignment by a Nat Geo or a BBC to go out and get specific images?
It's a bit of both. I suppose before 2010, it was all me funding the trips and trying to sell the images when I got back to stock libraries and publishers. After 2010, I was employed by a company called Oryx Photography based in South Africa, and then I was leading trips for them to the different regions. But yeah, so the Arctic for me was a cheaper option comparatively, because I think my first Arctic expedition cruise was about £3,500 plus flight. But that compared to about £9,000 or £10,000 for Antarctica. So you could do 2 for 1 in that sense.
Yeah, I just think like the entrepreneurial nature of a lot of people in the line of work that you do is often overlooked. It's often like, oh yeah, they work for Nat Geo, but it's really you work for yourself. And
sometimes it's a hell of an investment, and then you don't always get that money back, or it could take a decade to earn that money back through the images. Right. So it is always a risk, and sometimes, as has happened to me, the first time I went to Svalbard, I had 3 polar bear sightings, and they were rubbish. They were about a mile away. It was hazy. There was atmospheric conditions. All the images were sort of all blurry. It was awful. But like going to the Masai Mara for the first time or going to India for the first time, you're presented with such a different and actually a unique wilderness. Pristine. Once you left Longyearbyen, there's no people, there's no cars, there's no electricity, there's the only evidence of people actually having been anywhere are these little old hunting shacks that are old little old trapper huts. And it's amazing. I mean, to sort of come from central London and then suddenly sort of be surrounded by glaciers and ice and snow and sea ice as far as the eye could see, and clear blue skies. It was just
gorgeous.
It was just gorgeous. Yeah, it was just amazing. And actually, the whole experience was wonderful because, okay, I'd really gone there to photograph polar bears. That side was disappointing, but the seascapes and landscapes and ice scapes and just the sort of the habitat itself was just jaw-dropping. It was so beautiful. I didn't mind. I didn't mind the fact that the polar bear was about 3 pixels on my sensor. The glacier behind it made up for it. It kind of sort of, it was another sort of notch that sort of steered me more towards photographing animals in their environment rather than trying to get close-ups all the time. And there's massive bird colonies there. Millions of auks on these cliffs. And just an unforgettable sound and smell. It was. I was hooked. Just seeing my first iceberg. Just sort of lolling around in the water and just sort of being able to sort of getting a little inflatable Zodiac and circle around it and get a wide angle close up to it and photograph. So okay, it wasn't wildlife, but damn, this is to me this is just as beautiful. And so having been there, it was like, well, I've got to go to Antarctica now. If this is the Arctic, I've heard Antarctica is so much bigger. So within the year, I was booked on an icebreaker and spent 32 days on an icebreaker, traveling from the Falkland Islands right the way along the coast of Antarctica and out to New Zealand. Oh, cool. So we went around the peninsula. We had helicopters that took us onto the Ross Ice Shelf, took us to Scott's Hut. So we went into Scott's Hut, Shackleton's Hut, looked around. Cool. Actually could touch the. It's just. I mean, you see these. I mean, I've seen pictures of the penguin, the dried out penguin, laid on a table in Scott's Hut in a textbook I had when I was a school child. Yeah. And then I'm there. I'm touching. I'm not allowed to touch it, but I'm going to touch it. But it was just it was unreal. It was so weird. But people were right. The scale is the one marked difference, I think, in Arctic and Antarctica. So the Arctic, you've got polar bears and you've got flying birds, and in Antarctica, no polar bears and flightless birds. Obviously, the penguins and a huge amount of whales and seals. They both have their upsides. I think the one thing I enjoyed about Antarctica was being able to land on the shore and being able to walk around, amongst the penguins, getting the angles that I wanted to get and getting close up and far away and different compositions without having to carry a rifle or a gun of any kind, without having to worry about an armed perimeter, which we have to do in the Arctic. It's illegal to land on the Arctic in Svalbard without a rifle, without a firearm. Yeah, you can walk around. Is that
something that happens often, like that the rifles are actually used?
Thankfully, no. I mean, in my trips, I've never had to fire a weapon. We've never even had to fire a flare. So we have when we land, and we're taking groups ashore. First, there's a reconnaissance. So we go up and down the coast with Zodiacs to see if there's any polar bears on land. Then we disembark. We get onto the land. We set up an armed perimeter. So there's like 4 armed guards creating a perimeter, and then our clients can come onto the land and walk around anywhere within that perimeter, and everyone's connected by binoculars and radios. Twice I've had to do emergency evacuations. So a polar bear has just literally come out of the water at some point, smelt humans, and just headed straight for us. And we've had to do an emergency evacuation. So we have sometimes had to leave equipment on shore just to get everyone back onto the Zodiacs and into the water so they're safe. One time it was quite close. The last person got their leg into the Zodiac just as the polar bear came over the ridge and onto the shore.
Polar bears are different than grizzly bears in the sense that they eat an entirely meat diet and are a lot less. You're a lot more prone to have a problem with a polar bear than a grizzly bear. Is that correct? Yeah.
I mean, polar bears will actively hunt people. They are not afraid of people.
A guy actually, unfortunately, got killed.
Yeah, he
last
did.
week, I think.
Yeah,
in front of his kids, which is awful.
Yeah.
And I think that's something with polar bears that, I mean, really any bear you should be cautious of, but polar bears in general, they'll come for you.
Yeah, and I think people underestimate one, their size, and 2, their speed. I mean, size-wise, larger than a grizzly, much faster, and I think
Real, even on ice?
just walking, especially on ice, when they're walking, they cover so much ground, and they look like they're just sort of bumbling along. You know, the big arse is sort of wobbling around behind them, and they're
it's not
sort of
like
lolloping
grizzlies
along.
are slow. Grizzlies are
No.
fast animals.
Yeah, a polar bear is rapid. They can cover 30 meters in 2 bounds.
Holy shit.
Yeah, so you know it could be at a safe distance, and then four leaps, and it's right there. So they are, for us, they are treated with the utmost respect. And if we had to fire a flare or a round, we would consider that a failure on our part, because for us, we are there to protect the polar bear.
Yeah.
You know, it's the polar bear that actually comes first. We want to get the people away so we don't have to confront the polar bear.
100%.
So that's our philosophy. And it works, you know, it really works. As long as we are vigilant and we put in the legwork and we make sure the land is clear before we land, you know, we've never had an issue. So, you know, fingers crossed it continues that way. Sometimes I would say this, I probably shouldn't say this, but sometimes you meet people and it would be a real toss-up between who you would shoot. You know, and I'll probably get lambasted for that, but sometimes people put themselves in the most ridiculous situations, and it's a great frustration for me and for any guide that sort of leads groups of people, that they don't listen to you and they presume to know best because they've seen Planet Earth.
Yeah, well, I mean,
that.
I think there is a point in time where you have to understand that polar bears are wild creatures and they're just doing what is intuitive to them. And if there's somebody who is blatantly disobeying like the law of the land and what you should be doing in that area, like, I don't think that's a crazy statement to make. I mean, the polar bear didn't do anything wrong in that situation, and somebody's being an asshole, then, I mean, obviously we hope nothing would happen, but yeah, it's just sad for a polar bear to go out because some person's being a dick.
Yeah. I mean, last time I was there, actually, no, it was 2 tours ago. I left the day the polar bear attacked the school party up in the glaciers above Longyearbyen. And, you know, people died because the guides were ill prepared, hadn't tested their firearms, they hadn't tested their trigger traps, you know, their trip wires. And, you know, the polar bear paid the price, you know, for their failure. And to me, that is just, it's unforgivable.
I hadn't heard that. It was like school children.
Yeah, there was a school party from Britain, and they had. So when you arrive at Longyearbyen, if you intend to leave the city, you have to have a firearm. Mm-hmm. It's a government ordinance. So you can go to several outlets, and they will issue you with a firearm, a rifle. Unfortunately, you don't have to prove you know how to use it. You just carry it. They hadn't tested their firearm, and they had set up what you normally do in these areas is you set up a tripwire, and the wire fires off a banger, you know, like a flare. Mm-hmm. And to one, make you aware that there's something out there, but 2, to frighten off the bear. And that failed as well. So the polar bear went straight through the camp, attacked some pupils, killed one, but their firearm didn't work, first of all. So, you know, eventually they shot and killed the bear, but it should never have got to that point. You know, the tripwire and bangers, you know, should have worked. Yeah, their firearm should have worked to fire off a warning shot. But you know, it's a tragedy. You know, and
nobody wants. There's a certain level of respect that you have to give to entering into wilderness areas, and I mean that's an awful story in general with kids and everything, especially. But to be ill prepared in situations like that shows a clear lack of respect for the nature that you're entering into.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, it's easy. You can see how it happens. I mean, if you go to a place often enough, what's the phrase? Familiarity breeds contempt, and that's what happens. I think you go to these places so often. I mean, in our circles, the stories are they get more outrageous as time goes by, where people just they forget where they are, or they think they know better, and these horrible, you have to say, accidents happen, but they're not accidents. It's ignorance or stupidity, and
I think it's lack of experience. I mean, I'm guilty of it myself. I was out in Antelope Island, which is in Great Salt Lake by Salt Lake City in Utah, and you go out to Antelope Island, and it's a beautiful national park or state park with antelope everywhere and bison everywhere, and it's just a beautiful place. And you sit there and you always have just had experience or understanding of bison as these like slow moving cows. And I've only seen cows, and I was like, similarly to you, I didn't have like a long lens on me. And I was like, oh wow, I can get pretty close to this. And my friend and I like weren't trying to intimidate it or weren't being loud or whatever, but we're just trying to get as close as we can to get a good shot. And within an instant, it went from comfortably chewing grass to looking up at us and charging at full speed. And I mean, this is like a 2-ton animal that can go fast. I remember thinking to myself, like, if it wants to catch me, it will. Thankfully, it was kind of a false charge, like, get the hell out of my space. But I mean, I'm somebody who clearly loves wildlife, but even I make stupid mistakes by that, because you don't expect it to happen to you. And it literally happens in like the split of an instant.
Yeah, I mean, it happens. I mean, we don't have anything as large as a bison in the UK. I mean, we killed all our dangerous animals centuries ago. But our largest land animal now is a red deer, like North American elk. Mm-hmm. And there's a park outside London where I'd say they're habituated to people. You can sort of run by them in your joggings, and and they won't really sort of raise an eyelid. But there's one time a year when they're in musk that they are extremely aggressive, and it happens every year without fail. Someone with a camera or someone with a mobile phone thinks they can get really close, and the male just looks at this as another male, trying to square up. And people get gored, dogs have been killed. There was a video last year of some guy being chased around a tree by a really wound up deer. And people sort of find it funny, but if that guy falls over, he's going to be really severely gored.
Yeah, there was a guy who tried to take a selfie or something, or just a really close photograph with a bison in Yellowstone. I think a couple of years ago, the thing just ripped its head and put the guy in a tree, and he unfortunately died. But that's something that you look at as, I guess, from a layperson, as a docile creature. So I mean, polar bears, when you're in that area, it shows why the precaution is necessary.
Yep.
Do you feel, I know we've talked a little bit about it in our limited communication before the podcast, but I live in Los Angeles, and the level of anxiety that I get living here when I haven't been out in nature for a while is something that gets overwhelming. And oftentimes I need to go out camping with my friends or something like that to get a little bit of a stress relief. Do you feel, I know you come from living in London. We've talked a little bit about the mental health associated with that. Do you feel a connection with nature in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. I've struggled with depression from my late teens, and being in an office was very, very difficult for me. And it wasn't till I was made redundant a second time. I had been very ill, and I decided as part of my recuperation that I would just grab my dad's camera, and I took the dog for a walk into the woods, a place I hadn't been to since I was a teenager. And I think the quality of the air alone was enough to sort of just lift me up a bit. And then just sitting there and listening to the birds singing and just taking my mind off things by watching the birds around and the squirrels, rabbits, and some deer coming through, spotting a fox. And it was like the world's best distractor. And I think it has helped me cope, probably more than I can describe, being able to sort of leave the city, even if it's just within this country, just going to the coast and looking at those endless horizons and, you know, big skies and just the quality of air again, the distraction of wildlife and occupying my mind with something positive like creating a beautiful image, you know, a beautiful print. It's been a great antidote. I think for me, in reflection, it's also a double-edged sword in that as a hobby, it was wonderful. But once it's monetized, you know, there's a pressure to earn money from it. Mm-hmm. It does detract. And at some point, because it can be such a solitary profession and you spend so long on the Mac, hours and hours and hours of editing, you know, possibly for days, even weeks on end, that can have a detrimental effect. So it's in hindsight, it's something that is for me to be aware of. And now I can manage it in the sense that I have a timer, something as simple as a timer, that every 15 minutes I leave the Mac, I go outside into the garden, you know, and every 2 hours I have an half hour break and I'll do something as simple as gardening. And like, I know my friends might sort of cringe or think, what an old fart, you know, for gardening. But do you know what? There's something I've discovered this year, which has been particularly hellish. There was just something so healing about having my hands in the earth and the sun on my back. And it was the same feeling I had when I first started wildlife photography, just a connection, you know, connection to nature, and a connection to something bigger, and a connection to something that operates on a different timeline to us. You know, nature isn't 9 to 5. Right. It's just constant. You know, trees are growing in centuries, not just months. You know, it's all these sort of different times and motions that I feel much more connected to with wildlife photography, but also with a new hobby in gardening. And it's sort of combining the two now, because when I'm out in the garden, I'm seeing the local wildlife I have in my plot and I'm photographing that. And it's the flowers that I'm growing, I can photograph that. It's the insects and invertebrates attracted to those flowers, I can photograph that as well. So it's been a nice sort of interaction as well, in a sort of a weaving in of a nice hobby that's been sort of therapeutic, as well as my profession, which does come with stresses. It's people often say to me, I'm thinking of giving up everything and doing wildlife photography, and my first response is don't give up everything. You know, while you've got a full-time occupation, you can afford to take these, you know, rather expensive safaris, and you don't have to earn money from them. You know, you can make sure it works. You can make sure you can earn money from photography before you give up that sort of constant income of a reliable job. You know, people, they fall in love with the lifestyle, or the perceived lifestyle that we have, and thinking that we're flying here, there, and everywhere. You know, every week we're flying somewhere exotic, and it's a nonsense, really. You know, most of the time we're on the computer, just like pretty much everyone else. Yeah, we're processing images. Okay, if you're a hobbyist, that might sound like a dream come true, but let me tell you, when you're processing your 40,000th image of a lion or something like that, it's not quite as cute and fancy as it appears to be. So, you know, I think my advice these days, when people say they're going to give up everything to take up a career in this, it's please don't. Please approach it with a real sense of caution and perspective. This isn't an easy career to do, especially now when there are so many people wanting to get into it.
Yeah, and I think that really resonates with me in a different way than I expected it to, because for me, nature similarly has always had that therapeutic effect. But what I really gravitate towards is I left my full-time job, I think, a year and a half ago or so now to focus on wildlife film and media and the podcast, et cetera. And the reason being is just the 9-to-5 lifestyle it wasn't that it was depressing more than like I just woke up every single day being indifferent towards what I was doing. And I found that depressing. And I switched towards doing something that I wanted to focus on. But inherently, the flip side of that is that, yes, like I filmed a documentary in Hawaii for a couple weeks, and that was really fun and engaging and part of that. But I've also spent the last 9 months sitting in front of a computer editing that documentary.
Yeah, exactly.
And in complete isolation, working at home where my girlfriend, she comes home from work and like almost gets annoyed with me because I'm like a little puppy dog and I need so much attention. And like she's coming back from being in the office for hours and is sick of talking to people. And it is something where I think social media in general, like you only see the top 5% of everybody's life, you know? And I think inherently people start comparing themselves to other people. And when you're only comparing yourself to the best 5% of their life with a filter on it, by comparison, I think it lends itself to thinking poorly of yourself. And I think it's a really detrimental thing that social media is having on people. Not being like an old guy, like, oh, like there's new kids on their social media, because there's certainly benefits to it as well. But I think people really need to understand that no matter what your profession is or who you are or what you're doing, there's a flip side to all of it. And
I
to
couldn't
me,
agree
like,
more.
I've had similar things where hearing that I've been working really hard to take breaks every 2 hours and go outside. And unfortunately, I live in Los Angeles. It can still be a little hectic outside too. But making sure that I'm having that interaction on a daily basis, because otherwise it can get really dangerous.
I think that's something I lost touch with, which was that I've always been comfortable with my own company. You know, I've never really had to sort of seek the company of other people, but the more time that has gone on, the more I've realized that is quite dangerous. Not quite dangerous, it is dangerous. And without the sort of social interaction of other people, you get into a rut of thinking. You can get into a rut of thinking negatively, especially if you're prone to any kind of mental health depression. And so like this year, I've made much more of an effort to reach out to not just friends, but my photographer colleagues, just to sort of meet up in person, you know, once a month or, you know, once every 2 months. You know, I'll meet my friend Richard there and David there, and, you know, but so every month or every sort of few weeks, I'm actually sort of getting out of myself and meeting someone, and we're sort of having a good, engaging conversation about something other than photos and editing. You know, it's important. And I think from a mental health perspective, I found social media another quite dangerous aspect to navigate. And I never felt comfortable with it. I don't like sharing, you know, private stuff about myself, and especially to, you know, a community that are almost entirely anonymous, you know, they're complete strangers. And I think because I was quite comfortable with my own photography and my own abilities, I've never really cared that much about getting page likes or image likes, you know, or the number of followers. And I think it sort of occurred to me earlier this year that I wondered, what the hell am I doing it for? If I don't care about sort of online interaction, if I really don't care about who follows me and who doesn't, or who likes my photography and who doesn't, what was the point? And I realized I was in this sort of rut that you're told that the best way to sort of market your work and market your website is to get on Facebook and to get on Twitter and Instagram, and you know, and you drive all this traffic to your site. And I had to seriously sort of sit there and go, this is complete crap. And I closed my accounts down. There's some people that I sort of stay in touch with, and I, you know, and it's a mark of whether people are true friends or just complete sort of online strangers, whether they sort of email you after you've left, a social network. And, people are good enough to do that. And I reciprocate, and, people I've met online, we're still good friends, and we do meet up in the real world. But once I'd closed my accounts down, website to my traffic actually went up. And I just thought, well, where's this? I'm expecting this big sort of fall off in traffic.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I really sort of delved into it, and I decided to sort of have a look at Google Analytics and sort of delved around in that.
Yeah, why is that? That's interesting.
All my traffic came from Google or direct from my domain name. They searched for my name, and then that was it. It was all Google or the search engines, without sort of single one out. Hardly anything came from the social media networks at all.
And it wasn't anything, I think when you look at the value as an entrepreneur, you would rather have people on your website than on your Instagram, because there's just more ways to interact and get to know you on a more in-depth level. And if somebody is Googling you and that's the primary way of finding your website, and they're going on your Instagram, that's almost worse than them going straight to, is worse than them going straight to your website.
The flow is going the wrong way. And what I worked out was there was no traffic from Instagram whatsoever, which wasn't entirely surprising because you've only got that one link in your bio, which nobody clicks on anyway. I got some traffic from Twitter when I posted blog posts and posted, a new gallery of images. And I left Facebook years ago because I just didn't trust it. And but now, I've got rid of that. And what I've done, I've been able to sort of say, okay, I was spending so many hours a week on social media doing what I was.
It's a time investment for sure.
Told what I'm doing, what I was told to do, like a good boy. I'm supposed to sort of do Twitter. I'm supposed to do Instagram. Once I stopped, I realized I had time to actually sit outside and smell the roses, play with my dog, do some editing that I'd been putting off for ages. I was actually productive. And I've just found that spending so much time on social media is a completely non-productive use of time. Period. But I'm not saying that's for everyone. That's for me.
No, it's interesting. It's very inherently backwards with what is kind of being pushed on everybody now, but I mean, the numbers don't lie, right? I mean, at least in your specific case, there's a reason why it almost was hurting you to be on there. Yeah, especially, I mean, on top of it, aside from the metrics, if your time's being allocated there too, then clearly.
Yeah, I think you have to sort of, I think in photography, as well as many other vocations, you have to be careful with your time, because otherwise, as an entrepreneur or you're self-employed, you spend hundreds of hours a week for zero return. I mean, in the end, it can be like a friend of mine who will remain anonymous can be working on his website till 3 a.m. without realizing he's missed lunch and dinner, his wife coming home, and all the other stuff, and it's completely absorbing. And I suppose with retrospect, I've discovered how unhealthy that is, to be sort of so absorbed by what is really an imaginary world. Because let's face it, most photographers, like everyone else, are good editors, and you only put online the good stuff.
Yeah.
The thing about a professional photographer or, a great photographer means he's a great editor, and you will only see, the top 0.5% of what he shoots. And that's the only stuff that goes to print, and that's the only stuff that goes to the website. Mm-hmm. He won't show you all the other crap.
Right.
That we all shoot.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that time allocation, don't get me wrong, like there's certainly things that you can do online that drastically improve like your conversion rates and your success. But like small tweaks to the website and stuff, like I would spend hours working on like, oh, where's this link focused on the website, and what are the back pages there, and is my SEO all set up properly? And there is value there, but at a certain point, you just get diminishing returns where people like you because you take beautiful wildlife photographs, and if you're allocating 50% of your time to social media and website stuff, and that takes away from actually producing wildlife media, then
That's the thing.
ultimately it's not as important.
Yeah, what would I rather be doing? Spending hours trying to make sure that people like me online, or hours out in the field taking photographs that I can actually sell as part of a business?
Yeah, 100%.
I mean, that's I think what you have to draw the line on. Social media is social, but if you're a photographer, a self-employed photographer, your time is money, and I think we're horrible at valuing our time. Photographers in general, it's not like you can clock in on your own desk on your bed. If you've got your computer in your bedroom, it's 10 feet from your bed. You just get out. And you don't clock and register how much time you're actually spending. But if you did, I think if people actually thought about how much time they spent on social media and how much more productive they could be in the field, they wouldn't be anywhere near as much as they are.
And like, where's the financial trade-off, right? Like, I think, let's say you have 3x success being in the field versus focusing on your social media. Those are completely arbitrary numbers. And you can hire somebody for a fraction of that cost to manage the social media. Like, there's times where I spend so much money doing work that I really should be hiring somebody for just very basic process administrative work that if I was focused on creating and media focused, I'd make a hell of a lot more money than the 40 hours a week I'm putting into like really minute details of the work that I do. That like from a business like management standpoint, it just isn't smart, Yeah,
I think, and it all stems from, a lot of photographers come into this as a hobby, and then they try and make money from a hobby. But the psychology has to change. It's no longer a hobby. You have to charge for your time. You have to validate your time. You have to, if you're going to invest time in something, it has to be worthwhile. It's not, and I think we all get lost, and I certainly got lost in how much time I was spending. And I think when I took off the rose-tinted spectacles and I put my business spectacles on, I realized what a complete waste of time it was.
If you were to kind of look to the flip side of that, all in all, I mean, you've been able to travel to the edges of the world and see some of the most magnificent wildlife in the world. If you were to distill that into why you do what you do, could you answer that question?
How much time have you got? No, I think, well, I do what I do because it makes me happy. And I think that is incredibly important. A lot of people do what they do because they need to earn money. That's true. But happiness and satisfaction can be unquantifiable. You can't put a dollar sign on them, but you can link them to good health, good mental health. And I think you really, in any profession, you have to periodically take stock. And when I take stock, certain things happen, like I might reconsider social media. But in general, when I take stock, I'm happy. So that means I carry on. If I take stock and look at my career and I think I'm not happy doing this anymore, then I'll change careers.
Yeah.
I'll do something else. But for the moment, photographing wildlife gives me so much more than just money or a career or fans on social media. It kind of validates me because the office suit never fitted. The tie was always too tight. It just didn't suit me. So I had to have a vocation outside of an office. And I count myself extremely lucky that I fell into this quite literally by chance. And I put two things together that I was interested in, nature and a talent for photography. And I've managed to make it work for, well, over 13 years now, which is
huge.
Yeah, pretty good going.
Hell yeah.
Pretty good going. And but I still have that sense of joy, and I still have that childlike sense of wonder when I see wild animals. And it doesn't have to be lions on the Masai Mara. It could be the robin in my garden. You know, I'm still a child of nature, and I still get that kick. You know, so if I can make a living experiencing that still, then I'm very happy.
Yeah, to your point on the robin in the garden, not to pick one very specific point, but I always say that obviously familiarity brings about like a comfortability and a lack of interest in things, certainly. And I swear to you, if the squirrel, like your common squirrel, was as elusive or as geographically focused as like a koala is in Australia, you would go to Australia and be so excited to see a squirrel because they're cute and their bushy tail, et cetera. It's just I was talking to Anand Varma, who's a National Geographic photographer, and he works a lot with hummingbirds. And like, I saw a hummingbird this weekend, and like having the knowledge of reading like the science and the biochemistry behind what a hummingbird, like a common hummingbird, does, you really grow to appreciate it. And I think certainly that's something that I'm trying to take with me as I move forward.
I think it's quite a common an error. I think I've encountered a lot when I've done one-to-one sessions, or I've taken tours abroad to these iconic places, and people don't often understand when I say I would rather see a beautiful photograph of a common duck than a blurry shot of something rare. For sure. But some people don't agree. You know, what's the point of photographing a duck? Okay, get down on your knees and photograph a duck well. You know, and I'm not being funny, but sometimes people are stumped because they can sit in a Land Cruiser and they can photograph something out the window, but they don't know how to photograph something as common as a duck down there in a local park. And it's a familiarity that breeds contempt, but it's
the same reason that certain groups that get annoyed with elephants as pests because they're messing up their crops in Africa. You're like, how could you not revere an elephant? It's a beautiful animal. And you could probably show them a picture of a squirrel and they'd be like, oh my God, that's amazing.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We've got red ants and they've got elephants, pests are pests. It's only relative.
If the listeners could kind of keep tabs on your work over the course of the next 5 years, what can we expect?
Well, good question. There's going to be a lot more animals in their environment style imagery, a lot less sort of close-up portraits. That's almost completely canned now. I'm still going to be going to Africa quite regularly, and I'm hopefully returning to India again next year. So I'm still going to be shooting lots of big cat photographs. That's still going to be a big thing of mine. It's interesting because I feel like I'm back at the bottom of a learning curve. So I've got a lot of learning experience to look forward to with the medium format. So they might see some pictures that are a bit below par, but I'm excited by them anyway.
No, that's exciting.
Yeah.
And if you were to put a billboard on the side of the road that you could kind of disseminate one message out to the general population in 10 words or less, what would that be?
Oh, blimey. Learn to love wildlife.
Amen.
Period.
I like that. I think that's so important. Obviously, why I do this podcast is for that exact reason. So
that's brilliant. I'm really glad you reached out. I'm excited to be part of it.
Yeah, and I'm really grateful that you taking the time. Like I said, I love your work, and I'm super excited to. While you say some of this medium format might be below par, I think that's probably because you have an extremely high standard, and all of us are going to really, really enjoy looking at it.
I hope so.
I'll link your website in the show notes so everybody can check out your work, but I highly, highly encourage it. But thank you again so much. And to everybody else listening, until next time, stay wild. Thank you so much for listening. I honestly cannot express how much I appreciate you taking the time. For all information regarding this episode's guest, social channels, books, how you can support, etc., please check out our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please, please, please subscribe to the podcast. We are everywhere that you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Escape the Zoo on YouTube, follow Escape the Zoo on Instagram, like Escape the Zoo on Facebook, and please share with your friends. It honestly goes so far and means so much to me. And lastly, if you'd like to be emailed with each new podcast and any other major Escape the Zoo updates, visit escapethezoo.tv and sign up for our email list. Thank you.